President Putin last week gave a very long speech. I summarized it as Russia looking towards Asia now for economic partners and efforts to be very optimistic about U.S.-Russia bilateral relations possibly developing, and then of course profound pessimism about relations with Europe, and again using very derogatory language, calling European leaders weirdos at some point. But while there was a lot of efforts to have a benign posture towards the United States, there was also some warnings about sending the Tomahawks, which would be seen as an American attack on Russia. I was wondering how you see this development, because only now we also saw HIMARS being used to attack Belgorod, again, Russian territory, which also is an American weapon, which is assumed to rely on U.S. intelligence in order to pick the targets. Again, I'm not sure if I'm reading that correctly, but how do you see the developments with the Tomahawks? How serious is this?
I think that since President Trump opened his mouth and made the comment that he would supply Tomahawks to the Ukrainians, there's been a reconsideration. President Trump, to be frank, is often reckless with speech. He says things that are not necessarily false, but certainly a little short on being true. He exaggerates and leads people to frightening conclusions. I think he's somebody who interacts with audiences, and if he and the audience seem to be getting along well, then the rhetoric becomes increasingly hyperbolic. Let's put it that way. I think somebody got to him. I understand that he had a call with President Putin at some point. That may well have had an impact. I don't know. But he clearly had somebody sit him down and explain, you're talking about a missile system with a range of 1,000 miles. It could be fired from aircraft, on the ground, from submarines, surface vessels. So this is a very flexible weapon system that can reach targets deep inside Russia. And we know from experience with the Ukrainians that if you give them these weapons, they will happily attack Russian civilians and civilian infrastructure. I think once that was made clear to him in the Oval Office, he subsequently said, well, we need to know what they want to do with the Tomahawk and where they want to shoot it and so forth and so on. I have the feeling that he's going to back away from that. It may even go away, because I think he recognizes that this is a bridge too far for us. He doesn't want a war with Russia. Remember, when they began talking, that is the Russians and the Americans in Saudi Arabia, they had a very good meeting, but the meeting was focused on normalizing relations between Russia and the United States. If you listen carefully to President Putin, he frequently mentions the areas where he would like to see a resumption of normal trade. And I think President Trump privately feels the same way. Unfortunately, Trump's got himself into a lot of trouble in Ukraine. And not knowing what else to do, in frustration, he's become, or let us say he's made the transformation to become the new Biden, and has begun repeating stupidities and falsehoods that were common with Biden about what is happening in Ukraine and what could happen. But in reality, and you always have to distinguish what's said from what actually happens. So we can't provide the billions of dollars worth of equipment in a timely manner that would make any difference to what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine. I think he knows that. The Tomahawk system is sort of a last gasp effort to try and hand something to the Ukrainians that'll make a difference. Well, they're not going to make a difference. They could widen the war. They could escalate the war, particularly on the Russian side, and could put us in a difficult position with Russia to the point where we could be dragged into a war we don't want to fight. I think he's figured that out. So my expectation is that the Tomahawk stupidity, it really is a stupid idea, will vanish, will go away. It'll be quietly forgotten.
How are you assessing the Europeans here, though? Because, as I mentioned, there seems to be only contempt these days for Europe in Moscow. And in Europe, though, if you listen to the last speeches of von der Leyen, they it's almost a call for war. It's shouldn't shy away from retaliating against Russia, and you have German Chancellor Merz arguing, they have to build this massive army to possibly fight Russia. Yeah, people like Kaja Kallas, once made a point that it would be good if we defeat Russia so they can be broken up into smaller countries. Do you see this as being, how are you assessing the Europeans? Is this panic or, well, obviously the panic, but do you see them actually wanting to go to war against Russia, or they're just pumping themselves up for domestic audience, American audience, or Russian audience?
Well, you say Europeans. I prefer to say globalist leadership in places like France, Germany, and Great Britain. Starmer, Macron, and Merz are, let us say, graduates of the Soros school of globalism. They have been doing everything in their power. In fact, their predecessors did as well with Mrs. Merkel to open borders, create unrest and civil disturbance inside their own countries by inviting people in that could never possibly assimilate. In fact, there's a great deal of evidence they came to assimilate Europeans as opposed to the opposite. So I think that's part of their problem. They're desperate. They know that they've been discovered. Their sins are known publicly. Increasingly, people, particularly in Great Britain and France, I think, have come to terms with the reality that Russia is not coming. There is no massive Russian offensive into Europe, nor is there likely to be. And all they have to do is look at Slovakia, Hungary, and now the Czech Republic. These areas are right in the path of the allegedly on-rushing Russian military establishment, and they have categorically rejected this. So I think the time now is one of desperation, and they want to cling to power. How do you cling to power? Well, you continue to insist on this great danger to the east, and you start spending money you don't really have in the hopes that you can pump up the economy, and you're going to do it with military production. I don't think it's going to work. I don't see any future for it. The other thing is, Glenn, to build an effective force that can fight takes about 10 years. It took us 10 years after the Vietnam War to reconstitute our armed forces. And it was a very expensive proposition, but it took a lot of training and several generations of equipment and new generations of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. What are the Europeans going to do? How rapidly can they build something up? How rapidly can they train and field anything? That's why I think somebody said that Merz was talking about some sort of production level by 2030 with a force that could use the equipment. I think he's being very, very optimistic. I think it'll take much longer. So I think this is really all about clinging tenaciously to power. And, the futility of this and the stupidity of it is really shocking. And I was reminded of something, I don't think I've ever mentioned him before, but it's somebody I always admired, and that is Axel Oxenstierna. Oxenstierna was, of course, the great High Chancellor in Sweden, did a wonderful job under Gustav Adolf, and then subsequently with his daughter Christina. And his son attended a meeting with the king, Gustav Adolf, and he wrote to his father about it. And he said, I can't believe it. He said, the king must be mad. His ministers are crazy. These people are going to get us into terrible wars we can't possibly win. None of this is affordable. Literally, you could have lifted it from today, from what we're seeing in Washington, or for that matter, in Paris, London, and Berlin. And Oxenstierna wrote back to his son, are you surprised that we are ruled by so little wisdom? And his point was, why are you surprised? The people that are at the top are not wise. They're not thoughtful. They're self-immersed, self-important, self-absorbed. And they're not thinking in terms of what is in the interests of their people. So I think that's essentially what the Europeans are finding out. As I said, the Germans are taking longer, as usual, to figure this out. But they're figuring it out.
But when you assess a threat, you will look at the capabilities and intentions. Now, I agree on the capabilities, though. That is, that the Europeans don't have what it takes to fight Russia. There's a lot of ambitions about building up a military, the big drone wall. I'm not quite sure what that would actually entail in military sense. They have to flesh out this concept, I think. But in terms of intentions, first I thought, they're just beating their chest here, but on the other hand, they're talking now about intercepting Russian missiles and drones from the Polish territory into Western Ukraine, hoping that the Russians will agree to the new rules that they still can't be targeted. We saw France seize what they thought was a Russian ship, which, if it was, would have been an act of war. I mean, the crazy rhetoric does appear to translate to some extent into crazy policies, though.
Well, I think we have to stand back from these discussions about a drone wall and understand that what they're really talking about effectively is a high-tech Maginot Line. We know how well that's worked out in the past. It's a huge waste of money. The second part is, what can you reasonably achieve with the laws of physics right now? And the problem that we have, as long as we cannot break the laws of fractal mathematics and change physics, and that's what you've got to do, until you can create force fields, directed energy force fields, you cannot possibly stop thousands of missiles, thousands of drones. In other words, the offensive strike against you will always overwhelm whatever defensive system you set up. So this high-tech Maginot Line is an illusion. That needs to be dropped. It's prohibitively expensive. But here's the other thing. There's no evidence that the Russians want desperately to overwhelm and destroy Europe. This is a different era from, let us say, the age of World War II, or if you go back further, the 30 Years' War. Everyone is very sensitive, I think, to scientific industrial development, to infrastructure, to productivity. What's the point of fighting a war ostensibly for territory and people if you're going to destroy everything in the process? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So I just don't see any evidence that the Russians want to put their own infrastructure at risk, let alone destroy everybody else's. So I think there's a lot of nonsense on the street right now, and people are searching for answers, but they're coming up, unfortunately, with the same old ones. We have the same problem here with the so-called Golden Dome. The Golden Dome is, a large money pit into which people will throw hundreds of billions of dollars. The only people interested in it are, of course, the defense industries. And obviously, there are universities with physics departments and elsewhere that are looking forward to many wonderful grants, all of which are being asked to solve a problem they can't possibly solve. So it's a waste of time, money, and resources. But look how appealing it is, so much so that, the supporters of President Trump, if you bring it up, they'll say, well, you're negative. You're just being negative. This is important for us. Well, it's important, but you can't achieve it. You can't build it. It won't work. That has a role to play. I think the Europeans and we are all in the same boat there.